I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And Hannah is out again today, but in her place is Francesco DeSantis. Hello, Francesco.
Hello, Steve.
And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Today on the program, we welcome Sarah Anderson, who directs the Global Economy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies and is a co-editor of their website, inequality.org. Her research covers a wide range of international and domestic economic issues, including inequality, CEO pay, taxes, labor, and Wall Street reform. And we're going to talk about all of the tax loopholes that a huge behemoth like Amazon has at its disposal that are unavailable, guess what, to ordinary people, and how this fuels the ever-growing income inequality in America. Then Greg Leroy from Good Jobs First joins us to discuss his group's latest report called Cloudy with a Loss of Spending Control, about how these huge data centers being built around the country are endangering state budgets and sucking up a tremendous amount of energy, which has environmental implications. This also involves huge tax subsidies for companies like Google, Amazon, and Meta. Then we round out the program on a variety of topics at the top of Ralph's mind, including Ralph responding to some listener feedback from last week's program that featured former IDF Staff Sergeant and Executive Director of Breaking the Silence, Nadav Wyman. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, don't you wish you had Amazon's tax lawyers and accountants? David?
Sarah Anderson directs the Global Economy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies and is a co-editor of their website, inequality.org. Her research covers a wide range of international and domestic economic issues, including inequality, CEO pay, taxes, labor, and Wall Street reform. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Sarah Anderson.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Welcome indeed, Sarah. Our listeners should know that Sarah Anderson and her colleagues have put out report after report on the savage inequality between corporate privileges and immunities and ordinary people. And she's just out with a report that shows what Amazon and Jeff Bezos are getting away with as they negotiate with their corporate attorneys and accountants the massive loopholes in the federal tax code. Sarah, can you explain, as you always do, in plain language, how Amazon has benefited from these loopholes and the slashing of the corporate tax rate by Trump in 2017?
Yes, I would be happy to. So, as many of you know, there is a huge tax debate going on in Congress right now. And that's because of that 2017 tax reform that was passed under the Trump 1 administration and with Republican leadership in Congress. Many of the provisions in that law are expiring this year. And so there's a lot of pressure on Congress to pass a new tax bill. And it's part of this broader budget package where they're planning to give huge new tax giveaways to large corporations like Amazon and wealthy people like Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, and partially paying for those tax cuts for the wealthy by slashing programs that mean so much to so many Americans, like Medicaid and food assistance and so forth. And we thought, these issues can get very complex. So we thought lifting up Amazon as a prime example of our rigged tax code could help people wrap their minds around some of the specific pieces of this rigged tax system. And I do think that one of the most perverse parts of our tax code is the fact that we tax income from wealth at a much lower rate than we tax income from work. And so to use Jeff Bezos as an example of this, he sold about $37 billion worth of Amazon stock since 2017. And you want to know how much more he would have paid in capital gains taxes on those stock sales if we taxed income from wealth at the same rate as income from work? He would have owed $6.2 billion more in taxes. But instead, we allow people like Jeff Bezos to put all of that money in their pocket because we give preferential treatment to the taxation of capital gains and income from wealth. So that's one big problem with our tax code is this discounted rate on capital gains. The 2017 tax law also reduced the top marginal income tax rate. That doesn't affect Bezos that much because he just gets a very small salary every year from Amazon. Most of his money is through his accumulation of stock. But we looked at the CEO, the current CEO of Amazon, a guy named Andrew Jassy. So the top marginal tax rate went from 39.6 to 37%. And Andrew Jassy's enjoyed tax savings of about $1 million a year thanks to that one change. And, you might have heard that President Trump has been talking a little bit, or at least making noises about raising that top marginal tax rate up again on high earners. But the latest is that apparently was not serious and that Congress is going to move ahead with keeping it at that lower rate of 37%, which is something that just benefits people at the top, but not ordinary workers.
Now, compare it to Amazon workers. Let's say you're working in a warehouse in Amazon and you're making X dollars. Compare the tax rate and also the Social Security tax rate with both the Amazon Corporation and Jeff Bezos.
Well, last year, median pay at Amazon was $37,000. In other words, half of their employees made less than $37,000. So, do you think those people were putting a lot of money into the stock market and, benefiting from that discounted tax rate on capital gains like Jeff Bezos says? No. These people are living paycheck to paycheck for the most part. And one reason I know that is because I looked at Amazon's 401k plans. And you want to know what share of Amazon's 1.2 million employees who are participants in the 401k, how many of them have zero balances? 72%. So in other words, they have not been able to afford to put one dime into these tax sheltered retirement plans. And as you mentioned, ordinary workers do pay a lot into Social Security. They might not pay at that really low wage level, less than $37,000. They're probably not paying a lot in ordinary income taxes, especially if they have children, and there are tax credits for that. But it's completely untrue to say that they don't pay a lot of taxes, because if you look at Social Security payroll taxes, as you know, Ralph, your contributions to that are capped every year at about $168,000. So for the CEO of Amazon, he stops paying into that probably the first or second day on the job at the beginning of the year. Whereas the lower wage workers have money taken out of their paychecks every week all throughout the year. So one really astounding thing we looked at is that Amazon's typical worker contributed 6.2% of their income to Social Security, and that was 15 times more as a share of their compensation than the CEO contributed. And the CEO, of course, is making, I think, something like $27 million last year. And so, one obvious thing we could do to make the tax code more fair is to lift that cap on Social Security contributions.
How do you explain Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway, where in his latest report he was very proud about the billions of dollars Berkshire Hathaway is paying in federal income tax on its very profitable businesses? In fact, he said that, if I remember correctly, he said that his corporation pays over 5% of the total income tax revenue from all corporations in the U.S. paying into the federal treasury. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure because there is rampant tax dodging among the biggest corporations. With Amazon, the 2017 tax reform slashed the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. But most companies don't pay anywhere near that. And Amazon, in the first 4 years or so of the 2017 law, they had an average effective tax rate of only around 5%. So they've made use of various tax loopholes and credits and things, but we don't have a lot of transparency on this stuff. So I can't tell you exactly how Amazon avoided paying anywhere near that statutory 21% rate. I do know that they have enough money to hire an army of accountants and lawyers and lobbyists to make sure that they pay as little as possible.
Well, Apple Corporation is notorious for figuring out foreign tax havens, shifting profits and costs in an optimal way from the U.S. and paying very, very little taxes in terms of percentage of its enormous profits. In fact, there was a congressional hearing that you know about in 2014 just on Apple's tax strategies, and nothing changed. So, as someone who puts out report after report, and we'll tell you listeners how to get the latest report that Sarah Anderson's put out on Amazon and others, report after report, nothing changes. Why don't people get more upset about all this? Because they know, and they've known for years, that the ordinary worker pays a higher tax rate than these loophole-ridden corporations. And apparently about half of the corporations who make profit in the U.S. don't pay any federal income tax at all. They've rigged the systems.
I especially think that small businesses should be, and their owners should be speaking out more, because they can't take advantage of the kind of things that Apple can do, where they can hide their profits in tax havens. Amazon, I'll mention, also has subsidiaries in tax havens like Luxembourg. If you're a small business that's really rooted in your community, you're not going to be able to get away with avoiding taxes with those kinds of tricks. But I think in general, if you look at the polling, the American people are already upset with the current system, want to raise taxes on the wealthy, want to make sure that the richest Americans are paying their fair share, and wealthy corporations. This disconnect, though, between where the people are at and where Congress is at, and you could do a whole nother show about our campaign finance system and the excessive influence of big money over our political system, but there is that disconnect. One thing that does kind of keep my hopes up is I think there's growing support to do more fair tax reforms at the state and city levels. You know, in Massachusetts, they paid a millionaire surtax by ballot measure. They've got a new wealth tax in Washington state, also passed by ballot measure. So when people have the choice, they often do come out in favor of increasing taxes on the rich. It's just that there is this disconnect between where the people are at and where Congress is at, and big money in politics has a lot to do with that.
You think patriotic millionaires, a group of multimillionaires pushing for higher taxes on the grossly undertaxed super rich and corporations, having an impact? They have 20 full-time staff in their office on K Street in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I collaborate a lot with patriotic millionaires. In fact, they did a whole education project in small towns in swing states leading up to the last election. And they'd always have me be one of the first speakers because I talk a lot about CEO pay. And they knew that was an issue where there would be a lot of common ground with Republicans and others across the political spectrum. And I really found that to be the case. And there is something just so impactful, I guess, to have a wealthy person, like one of the founders of Patriotic Millionaires was a big shot on Wall Street, and having him go around and explain to ordinary people who are low income family members why he pays a lower tax rate than they do. And that is really, it just comes across differently to hear it from an unusual voice like that. And so I think they have played an enormously positive role. And also just to make it clear that not everything is about just wealth accumulation. They talk about how they're greedy, but they're greedy for things like good schools for all children and living in a healthy society. And we're not going to have a healthy, thriving society and economy as long as we have the extreme levels of inequality that we have today.
Well, something's happening out there, Sarah Anderson, because 85% of the American people want higher taxes on the undertaxed super rich and big corporations. That's a lot of conservative people, 85%.
Absolutely.
And still, Congress is not acting. The gap between public opinion on this issue and Congress is enormous because the Republicans don't want to have a fair tax system. And the Democrats are blocked by people like Congressman Richard Neal from Western Massachusetts, who, when the Democrats control Congress, is the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. And in 2019, when he took over, he said he's not going to reopen the Trump tax cuts. So what prospect do you see in Congress here?
Yeah, well, it's not just the Republicans who haven't had such a great record on taxes. There are Democrats who need more enlightenment as well, I would say. But I do think that the budget package that is being crafted right now by Congress, which will combine all these tax giveaways for the wealthy with these extremely drastic cuts for programs like Medicaid and SNAP and other things that really make a difference in people's lives, that it's going to open up a lot of eyeballs. If enacted the way that this thing is shaping up, it would be the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in a single law in US history. And I think if people start seeing children going hungry, people who are kicked off Medicare dying as a result of not having insurance, and really things that just absolutely should not happen in the wealthiest country in the world, perhaps we will see a building momentum for a different approach.
If that happens, don't bet on the Republican Party doing very well in 2026, to put it mildly. Before we go to Steve, tell people how they can get your report.
Absolutely. Well, I encourage people to I work at the Institute for Policy Studies, and we have a website called inequality.org, and you can subscribe to our free weekly newsletter there. And this Amazon report about how Amazon and its executives have been making a killing off of our rigged tax code is right on the homepage of inequality.org.
Inequality.org. That's easy to remember.
It should be.
It occurs every day and every hour.
Yeah.
In our land of the free, home of the brave. Steve?
Sarah, if you were advising a politician who wanted to make this an issue for the campaign, how would you advise, meaning the tax issue, and taxes tend to make people's eyes glaze over, how would you advise them to frame it? Would there be a phrase or a concept that you would have them put out there that people could readily understand?
I think putting human faces to the issue helps people a lot. I think telling people that Jeff Bezos, the second richest man in the world, got to put $6.2 billion in his pocket because we tax wealth at a lower rate than we tax income, that will hit home. And it explains why firefighters and teachers and other, middle-class people are often paying a higher tax rate than the wealthy. And by really telling people stories, I think you can give a much more compelling argument on issues that are intimidating and are complex to a lot of people.
David?
When you watch Fox, they say the wealthy pay most of our country's taxes. They say we're the most overtaxed country in the world. They say repealing Trump's tax cuts for the rich won't make a dent in our deficit. We have to rein in spending. That's the only way we're going to be able to pay, that we can't tax the rich out of our problems. Is that true?
I think a lot of things need to happen. We need to raise wages. We haven't had a raise in the minimum wage since 2009. That is outrageous. But taxing the rich is key to having a healthy economy and a healthy democracy, because without that, we will not have the funds we need to make the proper investments in our education system, our health system. And clearly, the ultra wealthy can afford to pay more. Their share of national income has more than doubled in the past several decades, and they can afford to pay more, and they should have an interest in paying more, because without investments in strong public infrastructure, health, education, and all of this, we're not going to have the kind of economy that they need to be competitive. And so it's in everyone's interest that we have fairer tax system.
Any last words, Sarah, on anything we didn't cover that you want to point it out?
I guess I would just say that there are so many positive alternative ideas of how we could approach our tax code. We could, for example, tie the corporate tax rate to the size of the gap between a company's CEO and worker pay. They're doing that already in a couple of US cities, increasing taxes on companies that have these huge pay gaps that have gotten so out of control in recent decades. We could be taxing private jets in a way that would hit the ultra wealthy while discouraging jets that contribute to climate change. There's just a vibrant debate that we should be having about how to use our tax code in ways that would steer us towards greater equity and sustainability. And it's just a shame that right now we're mired in this fight that's all about blocking proposal that would be about giving more tax giveaways to billionaires on the backs of the poor.
Yeah, we can tax pollution as well. The Canadians have a phrase, tax what we burn before you tax what we earn.
I like that.
We've been talking with Sarah Anderson, the veteran investigator for the Institute for Policy Studies, on inequality in the American economy, especially inequality between the large corporations and the super rich, in contrast to what people have to pay who go to work every day. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Sarah Anderson. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, Greg Leroy from Good Jobs First is going to give us the skinny and all of these fat data centers popping up all over the country. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 23, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Jonathan Stewart was into his fourth hour overseeing the planes flying near Newark, New Jersey, when he noticed two aircraft speeding nose to nose on his radar. A business jet that had departed Morristown Airport was heading toward another small plane that had taken off from nearby Teterboro, a hub for corporate flying. A mid-air collision was potentially seconds away, with planes flying at the same altitude. After recognizing the unfolding conflict, he instructed the pilots to turn the planes away from each other, which they did. That's according to a report in the Wall Street Journal. But Stewart was badly shaken. Hours after the May 4 incident, he fired off an email to the FAA criticizing their leadership. Frustrated with the current work situation and his own close call, Stewart took stress-related trauma leave. I don't want to be responsible for killing 400 people, he told the Journal. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Francesco, and Ralph. Probably many of you have seen these large warehouses popping up all over the landscape. Do you ever wonder what's going on in these places? David?
Greg Leroy is the founder and executive director of Good Jobs First, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research center on economic development incentives and corporate accountability. Good Jobs First maintains 3 unique national databases on subsidies and 2 wide-ranging databases on corporate misconduct. He's been training and consulting for state and local governments, associations of public officials, labor management committees, unions, community groups, tax and budget watchdogs, environmentalists, and smart growth advocates for more than 30 years. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Greg Leroy.
Thanks so much, David. Great to be with you.
Welcome back, Greg. Listen, this is one of my favorite citizen advocacy groups, and you'll see why when you go to their website, which we'll give you shortly, and when you listen to what Greg Leroy's got to say about his latest report. It's called Cloudy with the Loss of Spending Control, How Data Centers Are Endangering State Budgets. It's by Kashla Tarczynska and Greg Leroy. What did you find out?
Well, Ralph, we found that states have sort of put themselves in a very risky situation by enacting automatic incentives, virtually automatic, huge tax giveaways to the internet giant companies like Microsoft and Amazon, Google, Facebook, by not collecting sales tax on all the stuff that goes into these enormously expensive and complicated data centers that are popping up all over the country, especially now because of the rise of artificial intelligence. So already we could tell you 10 states are losing more than $100 million a year. Texas lost more than $1 billion this year. Virginia's close to $1 billion this year. And 12 states, including some that we know have a lot of data centers or are getting a lot of new ones, are not disclosing at all. They're not even telling taxpayers how much revenue they're losing yet. So we know of more than $3 billion already getting lost. It's probably much more than that.
Greg, let me ask you this. I'm sure some of our listeners are saying, what are these data centers? Why does artificial intelligence need so much burning of coal, oil, gas? And why do companies like Amazon and Microsoft want to more nuclear plants or bring retired nuclear plants back into radioactive activity? Just describe what these data centers look like physically and how many of them are being planned or under construction. I mean, it's crazy what's happening in terms of energy waste and reversing the controls of our energy economy regarding global warming.
It is incredible. So that's a lot to chew on there, Ralph. So cloud computing, data centers, server farms are all synonyms for these things. They've been around for a while, right? Cloud computing really became a thing about 20 years ago, and Amazon Web Services, it was always the most profitable part of Amazon. All the years that Amazon showed no profits overall as it gained huge market share in retailing, coming up only to number 2 behind Walmart, all those years it was masking its losses in retail by profits in cloud computing. It was really the secret sauce of Jeff Bezos's financial wizardry and success in Amazon. Amazon still has maybe 38% roughly of the cloud computing market, but it's also dominated by the other big boys and a bunch of other companies you've never heard of. Microsoft, Google, Facebook, the big internet providers, and now ChatGPT and some of the other big AI companies. So these are very large buildings now, the so-called hyperscale buildings that are now dominating the market. If you want to ever see them, go to Loudoun County, Virginia. There's canyons of them down certain boulevards. They just hover over you on both sides of the street. They're very tall, they're very boxy, they're very windowless. They are essentially warehouses full of computer services running everybody's social media accounts, all the YouTube videos out there, performing all the AI computations people want. They use up an enormous amount of electricity, and they have to be cooled because the chips create heat, right? So you use a lot of electricity to run them, and then you use a lot of electricity and sometimes water to also cool them, or otherwise they'd overheat. They also have lots of other things in them that aren't intuitive. They have all kinds of routing and switching. They have to have plumbing. If there's a lot of cooling systems, they have to have standby generation power because they can't go down. So you have to have usually a fossil fuel form of backup generating power station built into it, and that has to run periodically to make sure it doesn't get rusty. And of course, those cause emissions, even if some of the power powering the power plant is coming from a clean, renewable source. But we know too now that, as you said, lots of companies are extending the life of coal burning plants, planning to build new natural gas burning plants, reopening mothballed nuclear plants, or even slating new nukes, perhaps, to satisfy the demand for data centers. I'm not an energy economist, but, I've been doing a crash course. Between 2009 and 2020, electricity consumption in this country was basically flat, and that's not intuitive, right? Because population was growing up, GDP was going up for those 12 years, but we were getting more efficient. We were building green buildings. We were making cars that were more efficient. We were switching to LEDs and, after CFLs and lighting. We did a lot of things, and we have Energy Star, and our appliances were getting more efficient. But since 2021, we've basically gone back to almost 1950s growth rate in electricity consumption, and it's mostly due to data centers.
Explain why so much electricity is needed for this so-called artificial intelligence. Break it down so people can understand, because intuitively, you wouldn't think there would be such a gargantuan increase in demand for electricity in order to meet the data demands of these companies like Microsoft and Apple and Amazon and others.
Yes. So it has to do with both the complexity of the computations and the kinds of chips doing the computations, especially the chips. So to perform AI computations, the companies need what are called graphic processing units, or GPUs, instead of central processing units, or CPUs. And the GPUs, the growing ones for AI, consume about 9 times more electricity than the CPUs. So you have to have more of them, and they run at a much higher rate of electricity consumption. And they not only run more, but then they heat more, so they have to cool off more. So that's why they consume so much electricity.
Well, let's deconstruct the word data. What is this data that they're so gargantuanly trying to assemble? Is it our consumer preferences? John and Jane Doe walk into a grocery store and decide they're going to buy certain vegetables and fruits, and is that part of the data? The word data is too general for me.
No, that's right. So it's all forms of data, right? It's both our own personal data. If we back up our pictures in the cloud, they're somewhere in a data center. But if Jeff Bezos wants to perform surveillance capitalism on us and try to figure out our shopping preferences, or Target or Walmart or anybody else wants to do that, that data from our online purchases also resides somewhere in a data center. And of course, the federal government, the National Security Administration, the Department of Defense, the CIA, all have big contracts with the big cloud computing companies and collect all kinds of intelligence data and surveillance data and security data on servers in these things too. In fact, one of the arguments used recently in Richmond, Virginia, during a big debate about reforming or at least monitoring more fairly the activity of data centers in the state of Virginia was, we can't do that. It's national security.
But let me posit a hypothetical. Let's say there's no such thing as a credit economy, and all of us, hundreds of millions of consumers, had to pay cash or check. What would that do to the data reservoir that these companies want to collect on us, invade our privacy, sell our personal data?
Well, it would crash it, right? There would be no traceable fingerprints on the transactions, so they couldn't say who was buying what. I guess they could trace cash checks back to checking accounts, but certainly not cash anyway. It would upend the way retailers and marketers do business, for sure.
So people can fight back individually by just buying things with cash or check.
I think that's possible. I do think that the digital economy is here, whether we like it or not, Ralph. And I think the question is, for example, when I do searches online now, I get more results than I ask for, right? I get the AI spit out, even though all I want are some links. I didn't ask for that. I don't need it. Seldom use AI spit out. So why shouldn't I be given the option? Why should it not be the default that I get just what I want rather than what they think I should get for 9 times more energy?
In a footnote to your report, you say the report does not cover the following areas. Quote, while data centers have a big impact on electricity and water consumption, air quality, land use, and the quality of life in hosting communities like Loudoun County, Virginia, this report focuses only on the costs of state-based data center subsidies, end quote. Before we get to the costs, Greg Leroy, you're describing something that is insatiable and therefore unsustainable, the madcap expansion of these data centers. Is that true?
I think that's true. I think we don't know, for example, if there will be technological disruption in this space, right? It could happen that 5 years from now, quantum computing will develop a new form of computing methods and some new hyper-efficient form of chip that will leapfrog what we're installing in all these data centers today. That could happen, right? There's a lot of people spending money on quantum computing right now, and the federal government's making research grants. And, with noble goals, right? They're trying to figure out how to use big data to better figure out disease solutions and things like that. There's certainly some worthy objectives being tackled here, but I think anytime you have something become so disruptive in the land use priorities, for example, of Loudoun and Fairfax County and now Prince William County and so on in Virginia, where the biggest cluster is of these data centers, it's too distorting, right? And the subsidy costs of those data centers affects everybody in the state of Virginia, not just the quality of life immediately in those counties, because it means there's less money available for education, healthcare, transportation, all the big things that state government pays for. Frankly, public education and public health are the 2 biggest losers in every state giving away money to data centers right now, because those are the 2 biggest things that states support.
Well, the thrust of your report is in a quote in your press release, quote, we know of no other form of state spending that is so out of control. Therefore, we recommend that states cancel their data center tax exemptions. Such subsidies are absolutely unnecessary for an extremely profitable industry dominated by some of the most valuable corporations on earth, such as Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and Google, end quote. Explain that. To many people who hear these words, they say, well, how can a tax exemption represent spending out of control?
Yeah, great question, Ralph. And this is a really important concept for everybody to understand in public finance. So the concept of tax expenditure is a long-standing, broadly accepted concept in government finance, right? We spend money through the tax code for lots of different purposes every day. We give people mortgage interest deductions on their income taxes. We, in many states, don't tax groceries at the sales tax or medicine, and with good reason, right? We give senior citizens breaks on their homeowner property tax rates. And then we also do a lot of stuff on the corporate side, some of it in the name of economic development, some of it just pure special interest political muscle spending, frankly, right? And we spend money through the tax code for economic development, including for tax data centers. The trouble in this case is that when data centers first came online, 20 years ago, the laws typically just said you had to create 20 jobs because these things don't employ very many people, right? That's the other big dirty secret here. And you had to spend $100 million because that was a pretty good sized data center long ago. And if you jump those two hurdles, then everything you spent to build it and equip it would be sales tax free. Today, the big hypercenters, they might employ 100 people. That's still not very many given the size of the projects. And that might cost $1 billion or 10 times more than the data centers of yore. But because the law was written when data centers were very small compared to today's, it's automatic. Every project automatically jumps that hurdle. There's no question it's going to qualify for the automatic, often permanent sales tax exemption. And don't forget that the chips and servers have to get swapped out periodically because they wear out, right? And then those remain sales tax free as well. So now you're talking about, if you build $1 billion hypercenter in Virginia and the sales tax rate is 6%, that would be $60 million. About a fourth of it would go to local government and 3/4 to the state government. That's not happening now anymore. But it used to be only $6 million when it was a $100 million data center. So that's what we mean by out of control. You set something pegged to one industry, small industry, a little understood industry, and suddenly it's an industry that's devouring everybody in sight. It's much more expensive and therefore much, much more costly to the public till losing all that revenue.
Well, let's look at what Good Jobs First promoted resistance at the local and state level is achieving. As some of our listeners may know, Greg Leroy has such wonderfully usable detail on his website, right down to the locality where you live, listeners. So give us an idea of what kind of usable material for civic action to roll back or stop these huge tax giveaways centering on the data centers, but they also center on a lot of other parts of corporate extortion at the local level that you've documented over the years, Greg. But tell us what usable information for the citizen groups, and there might be some taxpayer groups listening, can use, and give us an idea whether any of these are being stopped, these tax loopholes or any of these tax exemptions are being stopped or rolled back in any community around the country.
So we have lots to point to, Ralph, and thank you for that question. So in the data center space, there's been great civic activism in a number of places right now. In fact, we have a national table of groups that meets every 2 weeks to discuss strategies and compare notes. So, for example, in Fulton County, Georgia, right now, there was a moratorium enacted because people were too upset, and there was a successful site fight against a new data center there in the Atlanta area. In Frederick County, Maryland, a couple of years ago, a group called the Sugarloaf Alliance successfully caught Amazon Web Services trying to sneak into the county and holding meetings that were later ruled in violation of the State Meetings Open Records Act with members of the Frederick County Council to try to convert some land to be zoned for a data center. But they caught him and blocked it, which was a great story. In Indiana, a group of 40,000 members of the Indiana Citizen Action Coalition recently won a terrific victory through their Public Utility Commission there, requiring that 3 big hyperscale data centers coming to Indiana pay for effectively all of the new generating capacity that's going to have to be built to satisfy those new data center complexes so that ratepayers won't get stuck paying the bill. That's another big hidden cost of these things in many states. If left to their own devices, right, states would rather dump the cost of these new utility capacity plants on existing ratepayers rather than forcing the internet giants to pay the bill.
Isn't it true that some of the resistance is environmental? There are people who are not keyed in on the tax exemptions and corporate welfare issue, but living next to these monster warehouses, the noise, the pollution, the traffic congestion, isn't that another source of public resistance? Can you spell that out?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, for instance, in Virginia, there's a very large table called the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition, and it's got about 24 groups at the table. Probably half of them are environmental, and they're concerned about water, land use, the fact that the voracious appetite for electricity means that the state itself has officially estimated that electricity consumption in the Commonwealth of Virginia will double in 10 years and triple in 20 years, which means that the state will get nowhere toward achieving its green economy goals that is also enacted as a matter of policy. Obviously, land use, open space preservation is key to groups like the Piedmont Environmental Council. Yeah, taxes are kind of a latecomer issue. We issued our study, frankly, because we knew that we had seen this and we've been blogging about particular states, but nobody had really put the national story together about what a taxpayer ripoff this is. And obviously, the other Trump overlay here, Ralph, is austerity, right? Every public official now knows that, especially come the next fiscal year starting in October, massive federal cuts are going to be played out on education, infrastructure, healthcare, housing and urban development, workforce training. We know they're trying to rescind a lot of the money that's already been appropriated. We know they're going to try to appropriate much less in the free play of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that they're working on in the Hill now, which means that instead of having 5 stimulus bills in a row that we had with CARES and ARPA and the infrastructure and the Science and Chips Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, now we're going to have severe federal austerity at a time when the data centers are eating so many people's budgets. So there's a real collision here between maintaining public services adequately in the face of federal austerity and plugging these huge holes in the bucket created by the data centers.
Do you find that your allies are coming also from long-established environmental groups like NRDC, Environmental Defense, Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, and other local environmental groups that are beginning to pay attention to these warehouses?
My impression that it's more local right now and local and state-based. I know that the national environmental groups have their plates really full doing defense on a lot of other issues right now. Another group that we like a lot and did a great study on is called the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEFA, IEEFA.org. They did a great study looking at how fossil fuels are going to power data centers in the Southeast, because that's the only way it's going to happen otherwise. And obviously, that's going to blow up the renewable portfolio standards and green economy goals for the Southeastern states.
David?
Well, let me circle back to the war among the states. Janet Yellen, Biden's Treasury Secretary, I think she was also the Fed chair once, she almost achieved a global minimum tax on corporations to prevent companies from shopping the globe for tax havens. Is there any way Congress could pass a law creating a domestic minimum tax? Is that unconstitutional? Is there any talk of this?
Great question. And yes, it was a hopeful moment when we almost got that global minimum tax. So there was a Supreme Court case, which Ralph may remember, called Daimler Chrysler v. Cuno on appeal, which was considered by the Supreme Court in 2005 and 2006. The Supremes did not rule on the constitutional issue. It's called the Dormant Commerce Clause, or the right of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. I fear that if something good were to happen in this space, like a positive decision that we didn't see in the Cuno case, that Congress would undo it. Frankly, it's a lot of inside baseball, but there was actually legislation queued up as that case was heard by the Supreme Court that would have basically legalized everything terrible about the war among the states. Because George Voinovich, then the senator of Ohio, who had overseen the case at hand as governor of Ohio, wanted to make sure that nothing good came out of the case. This is a very deeply embedded problem in the culture of our country and the idea of states allowed to compete with each other. The European model is the best here. Way back in the late 1950s, when the Treaty of Rome was being negotiated among the nations of Europe, those countries realized that if corporations were allowed to play states against each other, nations against each other, it would do two things. It would favor monopolies and it would impoverish government. It would reduce adequate revenue for good public services. And so they embedded within the Treaty of Rome a rigorous system that deeply restrains subsidies that companies can get in Europe. And the enforcement mechanism for that law resides within the Directorate General for Competition of the European Commission, which is to say there's more cooperation among the countries in the European community than there are states in the USA.
Francesco, do you have a question?
Getting back to the question of AI, I was just wondering what you think can be done about this. I mean, is there a historical precedent for trying to turn back the clock on something like this that consumes so much energy? I struggle to even think of an equivalent.
Boy, that's a good question. And you're right. Nothing equivalent sort of comes to mind. Of course, people think that AI is free because they're getting these searches free. What they don't know is that they're being addicted to apps and getting their data surveilled, but also they're ultimately going to get stuck with higher electricity bills and lousier air quality and all kinds of other impoverished schools and so on, public services because of the tax burden shift.
I think what AI needs is some GI, genuine intelligence, in order to curb its rapacity, frivolity, and focus it on where it can really improve people's lives and livelihoods. It's way beyond that in terms of its mindless expansion and manipulation. Now, can you slowly tell our listeners, first, how they can get your report, and second, how they can tap into your marvelous community by community database for all kinds of tax escapes that are depleting local and state budgets on behalf of corporate lobbyists?
Thanks, Ralph. So our website is called goodjobsfirst.org. That's all one word, goodjobsfirst.org, and the word first is spelled out. And this study is right on the front page of our website right now. It's called Cloudy with a Loss of Spending Control, and it'll stay on the publications page there, but it's top now until we publish something else. Or you could just put the word data centers in the search box and it'll pop right up along with other things we've published. We have a couple of databases that are especially useful for what Ralph's mentioning here. We have a database called Subsidy Tracker, which you can find easily from the front page of our website, which allows you to search for company-specific deals in your state, your city, your county, by company, however you want to search it. So you can say, okay, who are the big hogs at the trough, so to speak, in the tax base in our community? It's a very large database. We update it very frequently. It captures data from more than 1,200 federal, state, and local incentive program sources around the country. And then we have another database called Tax Rate Tracker, as opposed to Subsidy Tracker, which is specific to places. So 10 years ago, we won an obscure accounting reform in the way governments have to keep their books. It's called GAAP accounting, or generally accepted accounting principles for the public sector. For the last 7 years now, most local governments have been required to disclose in their annual spending audit, their annual comprehensive financial report, or ACFR, they have to reveal how much revenue they lost to these economic development tax break programs, which was never true before. And so now we've got in that database place data from thousands of school districts, cities, counties, special districts, how much revenue they've lost, in some cases for 6 or 7 years. And so you can see over time, is the trend getting worse? Is it getting better? Which programs are cutting the worst? But we're certainly starting to see now places being most deeply affected by data centers showing up with some of the biggest losses, along with other high-tech projects like microchip plants, some of which have been there for a long time, or some of the new EV or battery factories that are also getting huge property tax breaks and other local breaks. And then if you're also trying to reform a company or challenge a company, our most popular database is called Violation Tracker. This is a big regulatory database. It captures records from more than 400 federal, state, and local regulatory and prosecutorial offices. So every federal regulator you've ever heard of, and many you've never heard of, more than 100 of them, together with every state attorney general, utility commissioner, banking commissioner, district attorney that does white-collar crime, all the antitrust, consumer, foreign corrupt practices, wage theft, OSHA violations, unfair labor practices, all in one place and all married to the ultimate corporate parents. So we update the subsidiary. So if you're looking at, NetJets, well, you find out that's really a Berkshire Hathaway holding, or Nebraska Furniture Mart really belongs to Berkshire Hathaway. It's such an octopus of a company, for example. That's now getting used, we're very pleased to say, by 2 cities, big 2 local governments, the city of New York and San Diego County. They are using Violation Tracker to say to companies, if you have outstanding wage theft violations in San Diego, for example, as a contractor building a building, we're not going to let you finish your building until you solve your wage theft allegations, which we think is terrific. And the same thing about a restaurant. If your restaurant has outstanding wage theft claims, they can pull your license now. And the comptroller of New York is also using a wall of shame sort of dashboard with our data, pointing out companies that are wage thieves in the city.
You see why I think Good Jobs First is one of my favorite advocacy groups? Listeners, if you go to these databases and you don't have the wherewithal or the time to use the data, you can direct this data to a local reporter or a local editor or a local talk show host, or to local and state representatives who could have public hearings in your city, in town, or your state capital. Because I think Greg would not mind at all if there were more public hearings about all these escapes, these inequities, these levels of unheard of greed by corporations that are depleting community budgets for the necessities of life, everything from mass transit to repair of public works to schools to the various needs that a healthy tax base paid for fairly and fully by corporations, not just ordinary workers, can be restored.
I would encourage people, as you said, Ralph, to share the data with your local reporter, with your local community group. Send us an email. We do, it's easy for us to do a Zoom webinar and dashboard demonstration online to make sure people know all the tricks and things that are possible from the databases. And if you're worried about Amazon specifically, we have an entire database just for Amazon with more than $11 billion of subsidies documented and counting to their warehouses and data centers.
In all the years that I've been engaged in advocacy, I've never seen such useful sources of information broken down so that you can grab them and put forces in motion for a more just political economy. Thank you very much, Greg Leroy, head of the formidable group Good Jobs First.
Thanks so much, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Greg Leroy. We will link to Good Jobs First at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
Steve, there's some timely sensitive items I'd like to share with our listeners.
Yes, go ahead, Ralph. What do you got?
One is that the proposal to stop the rebate of $40 million a year to New York State by Wall Street brokers who have a tiny sales tax on stock transactions. And since 1981, the state has allowed them to pay in and then electronically rebate it, was the subject of a demonstration in front of the New York Stock Exchange recently. And a labor newsletter pointed out something very strange, is that most unions are not supporting this, even though there are deficits at the New York City level and at the New York State level, and they need revenue very badly. They're listening to the state labor union director, who is listening to the New York State controller, who's misleading him about pension funds having to pay a sales tax. Well, it's 0.1% sales tax, and it brings in about $40 million a day.
Why do you think they're running away from this, Ralph?
One reason they give is that they have other priorities before the legislature, which is a weak reason, because their priorities are to deal with their economic needs of their rank and file suffering deficits. Another is that they just have too close relationships with corporate interests. And the third is they operate in secrecy. You can never get them to explain themselves, never get them to listen, and it's a very bad situation. There are one or two exceptions in terms of labor unions, but this is something we're going to pay attention to in future programs. Why the labor unions are not aggressive in the interests of their own members, and why the leadership is so unaccountable.
Ralph, you also had put out a message to Donald Trump about Gaza. Would you want to elaborate on that for us?
Yes, the United Nations humanitarian leader came out with a statement saying the condition of starvation due to the blockade of Israel of food and water, not to mention medicine, electricity, is so extreme that 14,000 Palestinian babies can starve to death in the next few days. And I sent this message to Donald Trump because Trump takes credit for the ceasefire at the beginning of the year, and Netanyahu broke the ceasefire, thumbed his nose at Trump, and Trump shut his mouth. So in my message to Trump, I asked him why is he afraid of Netanyahu, and doesn't he want to come to the rescue of these innocent babies by saying, Mr. Netanyahu, the taxpayers in this country are paying for thousands of trucks stalled at the border of Gaza, full of medicine, food, water, electricity, fuel, and other critical necessities. We're going to put a little American flag on each one of these trucks, and don't you dare block them. No answer from the White House, of course.
So last week, we spoke to former IDF Staff Sergeant Nadav Wyman, who is the executive director of Breaking the Silence. And in the course of a generally anti-Israel or anti-Israeli genocide interview, he did mention the word mass rape when he was talking about what happened on October 7th. And we had a number of our listeners sort of latch onto that. And David, why don't you just read one of the comments that's representative, and then Ralph, you can respond.
Hi, team. I'm sure I won't be the only listener pointing this out, but there is zero evidence to support even one case of rape committed by Hamas on October 7th, let alone mass rapes. There is no audio-visual evidence, no forensic evidence, and no victims have been identified, either living or dead. The cases that Israeli officials and their flunkies have provided as evidence have been thoroughly debunked. Your guest, Mr. Wyman, casually referred to mass rapes on October 7th, which, at this point, anyone who's been following this nightmare honestly knows definitely didn't happen. It's a lie that has been used to justify genocide, and at this point, everyone should know that. I hope you guys can address his false accusation in an upcoming episode. With love and admiration, Andrew Noyce.
Well, Andrew, you're quite correct on this. This was a massive propaganda success by the Netanyahu regime. The Washington Post, New York Times, and others ate it up repeatedly, day after day. Columnists took it in the Washington Post and New York Times. People like Ruth Marcus and Brett Stevens kept repeating it. It was debunked by the Israeli television equivalent of 60 Minutes when they would take each of the accusations and say, never happened, and then show the evidence. There was never any proof of that. But it sunk deep into the psyche of millions of people, and Netanyahu basically got away with it without having to retract. What happened on October 7th was bad enough, and what has happened after October 7th is a massive death toll. Babies, children, mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers have been killed. People who had nothing to do with October 7th. And just recently, the investigative magazine in Israel called 972 and their star reporter, Meron Rappaport, stated that there hasn't been any fighting in Gaza in the last months. There's no fighters attacking the Israelis. They don't report any casualties. And as Mr. Rappaport reported, their routine work is just to go in with bulldozers and explosives and blow up one building after another or one home after another. They just go every day. There's 20 homes, blow them up because they want to completely devastate Gaza as a place that nobody can go back to. Thank you for pointing this out, Andrew.
I want to thank our guests again, Sarah Anderson and Greg Leroy. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Step up, you ought to step up. Rise up, I know you ought to rise